The LCD screen on your camera is not very good. It might seem a marvel of miniature engineering, but in fact it doesn't give you a good representation of what you're about to take. It applies exposure and contrast adjustments, among others. But there is a tool on that LCD screen that can help you nail exposure every single time. It's called the histogram, and if you don't know about it, stay with me. So today we're here at the beautiful St Mary's Lighthouse, and the reason I've picked this particular location is, as you can see, it's quite a high contrast scene. We've got the darkness of the sea, the sun's coming up over there. The whole scene is quite bright and contrasty, and it's a challenge to get the exposure right. Do you expose for the shadows? Do you expose for the highlights? Do you want to avoid clipping? Do you want to avoid noise in the shadows? It can be a nightmare if you're just using this LCD screen and perhaps the exposure indicators. What the camera is actually telling you in terms of exposure may not be the right exposure for your shot. Now, before we go too far, it's quite possible that your camera doesn't display the histogram by default. And if it doesn't, you will need to go into your menu settings and find out exactly where it is. Generally, it's under display or screen, depending on the camera, and then you will go into that section and you will look for histogram. You switch it on, and it's quite possible you will have two variations, or perhaps even more variations of a histogram. There will be the Luma histogram and an RGB histogram. Now, for the sake of today, generally if you're just shooting normally, the Luma histogram is the one to go for. The RGB is great for determining if there's excessive colours in one part of the scene, but overall you're looking at just the overall exposure using the Luma. So get that switched on and you will be able to see that not only on your LCD but in your EV as well. It's a really handy tool to have. So let's get into what the histogram is. Basically, it's a graph that shows you the distribution of exposure through the scene that you're shooting. And that exposure on the left is the darkest areas, and on the right is the lightest areas. And in the middle, it's all your midtones. Now, I like to think of the histogram as a bucket. If you fill the bucket and the water flows over at either end, then you are either blowing the highlights or crushing the shadows. If you blow the highlights, in general, they won't be recoverable. If you crush the shadows, you may well introduce noise, and that can be quite difficult to actually get rid of in post-production. So by using the histogram, we can determine the most accurate exposure that we want for the particular look that we want in our shot. Now, it's important to note that the histogram is not an artistic tool. It's a tool purely for determining exactly the exposure you want, as opposed to the exposure that the camera is suggesting to you. Now, the important thing here is to remember that RAW is going to give you a significantly wider dynamic range than JPEG. So shoot your RAWs and use your histogram. And as I've said, you'll be able to expand beyond the edges of the histogram and see more dynamic range without introducing clipping. And as I say, when we get these images back, we'll see just how far over or underexposed we have gone. I've used standard matrix metering for the shots, and the shot's fairly sort of generic, so the matrix metering should be fairly spot on. And we'll see just how far we can push these images beyond the edge of the histogram before we start getting clipping. So today, out here, if I'm overexposing, which is quite possible with this really bright sky, and I look at the histogram, I will see that the bunch of the histogram is to the far right. And if it's clipping, it will be spilling over the edge of the far right of that histogram. Conversely, if I'm underexposing, the bulk of the histogram will be pouring off the left side of that bucket, that light bucket, if you like. As it goes off that side, the further it goes, the deeper those blacks become and the more uncontrollable the shadow noise will become. Our aim is to get the exposure more or less in the middle so that it's not spilling out either side. Now, if you've seen my recent video on exposing to the right, you might also want to push that exposure slightly to the right end of the histogram. In other words, slightly overexposing it. And you'll understand why if you watch that video. But in general, keep the bulk of the midtones in the middle of the histogram or slightly to the right of the middle of the histogram, and you're going to get a decent exposure. Now, as I said, if the exposure is clipping off to the right end or the left end of the histogram, you will find that you're underexposing or overexposing. But it's important to know that the histogram is actually referencing a JPEG version of the image. That's to say, it's not the full sensor readout. So you actually have more latitude in that histogram than you might think. And the only way you're going to know fully is by going out and experiment, by deliberately overexposing, by deliberately underexposing your images. But in general, I've found on this Sony Alpha 7 R5 that I'm using today, I can get 1.5 or 2 stops more dynamic range than the histogram would suggest. But as I say, it's very much down to going out and experimenting, see what the limits of your camera is. But don't take the histogram as gospel. You do have latitude on either end. So let's have a little look at the histogram here. I'm going to be taking some shots of the St Mary's Lighthouse, just nothing special, just general everyday shots. And I will demonstrate to you exactly how the histogram looks if you're overexposing, underexposing and nailing the exposure. And when I get home, we'll put them into Lightroom and I'll have a look at just how much extra exposure we can get from the right and left ends of the histogram. So let's start off by taking some pictures. So this is the metered exposure, and as you can see on the screen it looks a little bit dark, but that may not be a good representation. If I cycle through the screens, you can see the histogram here. It's pretty much bang in the middle, but I can actually lighten this up. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to overexpose the image by decreasing the shutter speed, so making the shutter speed longer, and then we'll see how these images come out. And first of all, I will go, let's go 3 stops overexposed. So that's 2 stops, and if we go 1, 2, 3 on the dial, we now have 3 stops overexposed. So we'll now dial the shutter speed back. And this is 2 stops overexposed. And you can see on the histogram here, we're still bunched out to the right, but I suspect that may come in without any clipping. We'll now go to 1 stop overexposed. The lights change very slightly here, but we'll go for that. That's 1 stop overexposed. You can see the histogram is actually on the inside now, so we're actually in a position where we know we're not getting any clipping, even though we're overexposing and the zebras are showing us that there's quite a lot of highlights in the sky. And let's take it down to correct exposure. Obviously the light is changing as we move, but we'll see how that looks. And you can see this is the correct exposure. The histogram is pretty much bang in the middle. The actual image on the screen, it looks dark and maybe a misrepresentation of what we're actually going to get. So we'll take that image and now we'll go underexposed. So if we go to 1 stop underexposed, you can see it's quite dark, but we're still just about inside the histogram there. And now we'll go to 2 stops. 1, 2, 3. Pretty dark, but possibly still just inside the histogram. And now we'll go to 3 stops. 1, 2, 3. And you see that's very dark. The histogram is pouring out the left-hand side now. So as I mentioned, a lot of the LCD displays on cameras have multiple modes, and you'll see on this one, if I cycle through, this is my standard one with the histogram and my exposure data underneath here. If I go up, I add in a horizon and add in the exposure modes that I'm using. Here, as I mentioned before, is purely the data, lots of information there, very good representation of the histogram just there. If I change the exposure, you'll see that move left and right. And also the metered exposure just here. And if we go up again, that's my basic display screen. As well as the histogram, modern cameras also have other things that can determine whether you're overexposing, and it's worth using all of them. You have things like zebras, and you also have things like clipping highlights, which will flash up black and white where the image is actually clipping. But for overall, in general, the histogram is going to do a very, very good job. So I've taken a few images, underexposed, overexposed and correct exposure. And as you have seen, the histogram moves as you change your exposure. And that doesn't matter whether you're using aperture, shutter speed or ISO or a combination of all 3. That histogram is merely showing you the distribution of tones within that exposure, nothing else. So in summary, if you really want to nail your exposures, get using the histogram. It's such an invaluable tool. As I said earlier, think of it as a bucket of light. If there's stuff spilling out to the left, you're underexposing your image. If it's spilling out to the right, you're overexposing your image. Learn the limits of your raw files using the histogram, and you'll be on your way to absolutely nailing every single exposure. It'll become second nature. You'll see it clipping out to the right, so you'll increase your shutter speed a little bit. So welcome back to the studio. I've got the images in Lightroom here, along with some of the others that I shot on that day. I've edited a few of them as well. Let's get into Lightroom and we'll have a little look at exactly what we've got, and we can look at the histogram in Lightroom as well, which I believe is also a JPEG representation rather than the raw representation. Let's head into Lightroom. So as you can see, we have the images in Lightroom now, and we've got the 3 stops over, 2 stops over, 1 stop over, correct exposure, -1, -2, -3. So let's take the +3 and take that over into the develop module to see just how overexposed it is. And you can see it really is overexposed. If we look at the histogram on the right hand side, much of the sky is blown out. None of the shadows are blown out, and we're drifting way off to the right side of that histogram. The question is, can we pull it back? Let's have a look, and we'll pull back the exposure as far as we can to bring that highlights in. And there we go. And you will see that, in fact, on this particular Sony Alpha 7 R5, at 3 stops over the metered exposure, we've actually managed to pull back those highlights. Personally, I'm quite surprised, perhaps astounded by that, but very pleasantly surprised. We can bring up the shadows a little bit. I'm not going to do a major edit on this photo, but we'll do a little bit of editing. And if we zoom in, not the sharpest, I left the image stabilization on again. But that is a perfectly usable image. There's no noise in it. We're at 100 ISO, but even though we've pulled it back 3 stops, it looks very workable. What it does show is that a raw file will go way beyond the edge of that histogram on the right hand side, so you can pull back the highlights. Now let's go and have a look at the 3 stop underexposed image, and as you can see, that's very underexposed. We'll take that over to the develop module, and we'll bring the exposure up 3 stops as we did with the other one. And as you can see, we've brought it in up 3 stops, and the clipping on the shadows is gone, no clipping on the highlights. But have we introduced any noise into the image? And the answer is yes, there is definite noise here. If we take that up to 200%, there is definitely noise that's been introduced here by bringing up the shadows. So this actually also confirms the fact that shooting slightly to the right is a much better way than shooting to the left and crushing the shadows. Let's compare the 2 images side by side, the overexposed and the underexposed. The one on the left is the overexposed image, and the one on the right is the underexposed image. Excuse the fact that there was a little bit of camera shake or ibis going on, but you can still clearly see that in the overexposed shot, as we've pulled it down, there is no shadow in it. And in the underexposed shot, there is actually quite a lot of shadow at 100%, at 200% viewing. So I hope you've enjoyed this video on the histogram. I hope it's been helpful. Histograms are such powerful tools that we really do need to use them, and particularly when the exposure is a little bit tricky to work out. You might have a lot of highlights, some deep shadows. Let me know your experiences of the histogram in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this video, a like would be fantastic. A subscription would be even better. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one.